Okay, thank you. So in this presentation, I'll be presenting some findings from a research project that explores the drivers of support for the Liverpool City Region, Combined Authority and Metro Mayor. And this is an offshoot of a broader research project that looks at the politics and the political consequences of Scouse identity. And I'm hoping to submit this to a journal in the near future, so any feedback would be greatly appreciated. So I'm sure we're all familiar with the concept of combined authorities, metro mayors, and the processes and the reasons and the rationales by which they were set up. In the process, or in the case of the Liverpool City Region, the process of formation was relatively smooth. It was helped by the fact that all councils were run by the Labour Party, and only once did a politician threaten to take somebody to court, which is quite good going in Liverpool. Unlike in Greater Manchester, the mayor hasn't taken over the role of Police and Crime Commissioner, because the City Region actually covers two separate policing areas, two separate counties, Merseyside and then part of Cheshire, which is the Halton Borough, which you can see on the bottom of the map there. So there's clearly a gap in the existing literature around metro mayors, with the role of voters, or the people, being largely ignored. And this is partly a consequence of how metro mayors as a body came about. So, as I'm sure we're all aware, these were quite an elite level process, and this is kind of reflected in the analyses so far, which are quite elite level as well, right? So they tend to be focused on why combined authorities were established, the process by which deals were produced, and whether the combined authorities and metro mayors are likely to be successful based on the government's own rationale. Later studies, now we're kind of one full election cycle in, have aimed to assess the impact of mayors on local leadership and economic outcomes. And all of this is obviously clearly important work, but like I kind of said, the process of English devolution deals themselves has a focus on the elite level, and the scholarship has followed. Even popular concepts such as place-based leadership, they're quite nebulous, and they kind of leave very little role for citizens within them. In a lot of cases, the main work on public opinion and mayors, both on a kind of metro level and the local authority level, has come from think tanks. And even these focus more on what the public know about metro mayors and their views on the appropriate range of powers the metro mayor should have, rather than whether they're supported or not. And perhaps it's not uncharitable to say that this is because these think tanks support the positions of metro mayors anyway. So Centre for Cities did a really good series of polling of the then existing combined authorities and asked, do you think metro mayors should have more power over these policy areas, right? But it didn't actually say, do you think there should be a metro mayor? And that's something I'd like to fill with this paper. And I think it's important because we've seen the kind of relative lack of popularity of local authority mayors, but this doesn't seem to be questioned on the metro mayor level. So I won't go through all of these hypotheses, but I thought I'd list them out. So in the paper, I generate a series of hypotheses, and where possible, it's rooted in the literature, but if not, I'd also draw on examples from devolution to Scotland and Wales. Because of time, I won't go into too much detail, but the variables I'm exploring are local identity, and that's measured as how Scouse, an individual, feels, which is the kind of the dominant local identity within Merseyside, and that's measured on a scale of 1 to 7. The actual physical location where a respondent lives in the city region, the idea being that if you live in Liverpool, you'll be more likely to support it because you might feel a greater affinity for the Liverpool City Region, whereas if you live somewhere like Southport, which kind of wants to be part of Lancashire, or you live in St Helens, has some areas, some pockets of strong identity there, you'll be less likely to identify with the city region. Level of support or strength of support for Labour, because obviously it's unlikely that another party is going to fill the position of Metro Mayor in the short or medium term. How satisfied you are with democracy within Liverpool and within the UK as a whole. Your political or ideological values measured by the left-right, authoritarian, libertarian and popular scales, as well as including views on equal opportunities, which might tap into a broader social conservatism. And these are the same measures that are used in the British election study. And then also a strength of English and British identity as well. And I also included European identity just to fill this set. The data for this paper came from a poll conducted by a panel based for me. The sample size was 616 respondents across Merseyside, so not the Liverpool City Region, so the borough of Holton is included. But once entries with missing data, etc. removed, we have 562 respondents. Like I said, the question and the answer structure was modelled on the British election study, so in other bits of research I can compare. I can say, for instance, compare how people who identify as Scouts compare with people who identify as English or as Scottish or as Welsh. And the kind of main structure of this paper is a series of logistic regression analyses, right? And the dependent variable is a dummy variable where one represents the response, the Liverpool City Region Combined Authority with a Metro Mayor is a good idea. And from the whole sample, we had 299 out of 562 responses to this saying yes, which is 53%. And then alternatively, 0 represents the Liverpool City Region Combined Authority with a Metro Mayor is a good idea, but my area should not be included. That's 24% of respondents. And the Liverpool City Region Combined Authority with a Metro Mayor is a bad idea and should be abolished, which is 22%. So combined, that's 299 positive responses to 263 negative responses, which is just off that golden ratio of 52 to 48, which I'm quite disappointed by. And then I've also included demographic controls for gender, age, socioeconomic group, and income. Okay, so the first three hypotheses look at the role of Scousness of Liverpool residents and of how you rank Labour. Now, what these charts show are the logistic regression coefficients for each of the first three models. So the blue lines represent the Scouts model, the orange lines represent the Liverpool resident model, and then the green lines represent the Labour support. Now what we can see is that our controls for age, class, or socioeconomic group, and income are not statistically significant because they cross this dotted line here at 0. But we can see that in all cases, being male means you're much less likely to support the Liverpool City Region, which is something that I think is quite interesting, and obviously this effect is something that stays across all of the models, as we'll see. And I'm not quite sure why. I kind of just expected this to be statistically insignificant, but it's not. But in terms of our hypothesis, we find some evidence that those who feel more Scouts are more likely to support the position of Metro Mayor, which is what we'd expect. We find that those who live in Liverpool are a lot more likely to support the Liverpool Metro Mayor or Liverpool City Region Metro Mayor. And those who rank the Labour Party more highly are more likely to support the position as well. And conversely, it's not included here, but those who rank the Conservatives more highly are less likely to support it. And those who rank the Lib Dems are more likely to support it. And that might be because they feel like their party could win at some point, or that because they, as a party, as an ideology, they're just happier with devolved powers. In terms of satisfaction with democracy, this is all one single model. We find that if you are satisfied with democracy in Liverpool, you are more likely to support the Metro Mayor. But of course, this has a chicken and egg kind of situation here, because if by now, by the time of this polling, the role of the Metro Mayor was already established, so was already part of satisfaction with democracy in Liverpool. So it's kind of asking, are you happy with the status quo? And the status quo involves the Metro Mayor. What is interesting, though, is that this response might be somewhat dampened because this was taking place whilst Joe Anderson, all the news about his alleged criminality was coming to light. So this might actually be lower than it would otherwise be if the news wasn't focused on that. But what is interesting is that those who are less satisfied, so those who are more satisfied with democracy in the UK as a whole, less likely to support the position of Metro Mayor. So they tend to think, oh, actually, things are all right on the UK level. We don't need this new level of democracy. Perhaps it might be seen as unnecessary. And this could also tie in with the fact that assessments of democracy are influenced by party or parties in office. So satisfaction with democracy in America flipped between Republicans and Democrats when Biden took office, even though, organisationally, constitutionally, nothing had changed. So as a side experiment, which isn't shown here, I included respondents' ranking of Labour and Conservatives to attempt to control for, whether this is actually just a proxy for people don't like the Tories in government. And this statistically significant relationship here disappeared. So it suggests somewhat this variable is acting as a proxy for support for the governing party. There's a lot of lines here, but it's the same idea, right? So the light blue line shows the right-left model, orange libertarian authoritarian, and so on. And then this dark blue line is the full model. And again, we see that gender is statistically significant. Women are more likely to support the position of metro mayor. But we see that in terms of left-right position, the more left-wing you are, the more likely you are to support the position. And the more libertarian you are, the more likely you are to support the position, or the less authoritarian you are, the more likely you are to support the position. Now, interestingly, the authoritarian relationship disappears when we control for all of the ideological positions. What I think is most interesting is those who have an element of social conservatism vis-a-vis thinking measures for equality have gone too far are much less likely to support the positions, and this relationship stays even when we include other measures, right? So it's tapping into something different than the authoritarian libertarian scale. And we see actually populist values aren't statistically significant at all, which kind of goes against a lot of the literature of what it is populists want, right? Do they want power closer to them because they don't trust elites? Well, that doesn't seem to be borne out here. And then finally, we have our English and British and European identity. You can see that in the bivariate model, Englishness is statistically significant. The more English you feel, the less likely you are to support the position. But we see in the full model, it's only how European you feel, which is really interesting because I only included this because it was there and just thought, let's see what happens. And it turns out that this is one of the consistently strongest predictors of whether you support the position at all. Now, why might this be? Well, in the case of Englishness, it might be because identity is typically correlated with a form of cultural conservatism, which might be opposed to constitutional meddling, or you might not like the idea of England being broken up into city regions, right? You might think the rightful level of political community is England as a nation. And it might be that Englishness is also correlated with conservative support, but the relationship here is maintained when we control for how a respondent ranks the Conservative Party, whether they support them from it or not. And similarly, the relationship for Europeanness is maintained, even when we control for how respondents rank Labour, the Lib Dems, the Conservatives, and for how they voted, or how they would vote, in a hypothetical rejoining referendum. There is, however, some evidence that the European identity is driven by the centre-periphery cleavage within the Liverpool City Region. So if we include a dummy variable representing whether a respondent lives in Liverpool, both Europeanness and living in Liverpool are statistically significant. But if we include it as an interaction effect, only the interaction is statistically significant. So this suggests that having a European identity is more important in explaining support for the Liverpool City Region for those who live in Liverpool than for those outside of Liverpool. And this is probably because your European identity ties into a bundle of broader views or values that are associated with devolution as well. And then finally, this shows a full model, so every variable included, but it also shows a stepwise model. And this is generated by a stepwise selection technique, which aims to produce the model with the lowest AIC value with the minimum amount of variables. So basically, what is the most parsimonious model that fits the data well? And this keeps 7 out of the 17 variables. So 7 out of the 17 variables were dropped by the stepwise algorithm, suggesting it didn't actually increase the fit of the model at all. And it suggests actually our stepwise model has a better fit with the data. And all variables act in the expected direction. Now, what is interesting is that it's geography, not identity, here that is seen as significant in terms of determining support, or that fits the data best, right? So it's not whether you feel Scouse or not, it's whether you live in Liverpool or not, which suggests, as a kind of policy view that, the metro mayor might want to work on speaking to areas that don't necessarily feel like they benefit. We see the party politics also plays a role, so despite being the creation of the Conservatives, there's a positive correlation between ranking Labour highly and support for the Metro Mayor. And like I said before, this is probably because a Labour candidate is almost certainly going to win. We don't find evidence for the Metro Mayors being driven by views on democracy, nor authoritarianism or populism, nor English or British identity, all of which have quite a good basis in the literature on devolution to Scotland and Wales. Right, so you replace Scottishness with Englishness, and support for devolution to Scotland shoots up. We don't see that here. But like I said before, the most interesting things I think are the European identity and this equality variable, things that I wasn't actually going to include if this was a pure theory-based variable selection. I just included them because they were there. And these seem to tap into something deeper that also aligns with support for Metro Mayors. And I mean, the relationship, the direction of the relationship isn't surprising, but the fact that they are so significant is interesting. And finally, the other thing that I've not noted is that gender and age are both statistically significant here. Older voters are more likely to support the position, and men are less likely to. There's something that I'd like to, if anyone has any thoughts on why, I'd be really interested. But I think I'm running out of time, so I will end it there. Thank you.